So what Paul is implicitly letting us know right there is that the same message he preached there is the one he's preaching everywhere he goes. Paul's not changing the message. So that snippet we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, is something that Paul has received, and he is passing it on unchanged. Now, when did Paul receive that? Even critical scholars who are criticizing the New Testament, they recognize that this tradition emerges within a very short time after the claims of Jesus' resurrection in the 30s AD. So it's beginning to circulate in this brief account in the 30s. Now, what begins to happen then later on is that we reach a point at which the eyewitnesses are beginning to die out or to be killed in the 60s. And so when the eyewitnesses begin to be lost, there gets to be an urgency about writing down the full story. And so we have the Gospel of Mark and then the other Gospels emerging at that time to preserve the accounts of the eyewitnesses. And so all four of those Gospels in different ways can be traced back to eyewitness accounts, but they are preceded by an oral history that they're being told and it's being repeated that is not being changed as Paul travels from place to place and is apparently not being changed from what he received. So this account of the resurrection is something that has a solid history, a reliable history that is traceable to the places, to the times, and to the people that actually experienced these events.
If you will, talk to the importance of that issue, because you write that it is important to trace the accounts back to the time and place where the events happened. So why is that important in terms of the validation of the resurrection?
Well, one of the most important things is the same thing we know in a court of law, and that is simply that eyewitness testimony, though it can be in error at times, we recognize that, we admit that, but eyewitness testimony is the best thing that we have to understand what really happened. And so eyewitness testimony of people who were actually there, is very important for an event like this. And the resurrection is this momentous event that is reported in generally the same way in multiple places. So not only do we have eyewitness accounts, but we have multiple eyewitness accounts that are not identical to one another, but they tell the same basic story. And on that, it's the same thing as if you're a parent, you recognize when you are a parent that one of your key goals as a parent is to find out which kid is telling the truth and which one is lying. And one of the things you do, or at least I do, put them in different rooms and say, all right, you tell me the story, then I go to the other room, you tell me the story, and I'm trying to figure out which one is telling me the truth about things. And it's very important to be able to do that. But we do that recognizing that although there may be differences in the accounts of what happened, we're looking for things that are similar, the same. Then we're asking which one is more reliable. Then we're asking something else. Which one is doing what we would call it's called an admission against interest is the term for it. That is something that they admit that is not in their best interest. And again, you see that in the New Testament. So you see eyewitness accounts, but you also see what I would call admissions against interest. There are things told in there that don't put Christians, and certainly sometimes don't even put the person, some of the key people, in the best light. And yet they tell these things anyway. Well, that tells us not only that these are eyewitness accounts, but that these are eyewitness accounts which have an interest in telling the truth. The same thing as with Mary Magdalene as the first witness. That's something that you're not going to put in unless you're very deeply interested in telling the truth about what actually happened. It's something that it's an admission against interest. If you are fabricating it, you're not going to make that up because it could hurt your case, yet they tell it because that's the way it actually happened. That's how we should be thinking about these accounts. The same thing as we think in a court of law, or when you're talking to your kids trying to figure out who's telling the truth, is you're asking what's reliable, who saw this, who was actually there at the event that's being described, and who is telling me things that may not be in that person's best interest, but they're admitting it anyway. There's all those things and more that are all present in the Gospels in the New Testament.
The Bible is transparent. It's almost as if it's inviting questions on a number of levels. How do skeptics react to these kinds of testimonies when they look at the evidence of the four gospel writers and everything that you just mentioned, the time, the dates, where the events happen, how does a skeptic react to these things?
Well, they're going to point out, you think somebody like Bart Ehrman, for example, that there is a distance of time between the events and when it was written in the Gospels. Okay, and we'll admit that Mark's Gospel is probably written sometime in the 60s AD, and that's 30 or so years after the time when this event happened. They're going to point out things like that. What they may not always point out to us is that that's not altogether uncommon in the ancient world, for there to be decades between an event and the reporting of that event in a full-fledged form of a full written form. It's not at all uncommon, but that's one of the things that they might push back on. Another one, I think of Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Before the Gospels, is going to question the reliability of eyewitness testimony. But what is often missed in that is that the tests that are used to show that eyewitnesses can be in error are usually designed to try to find out how much error there is. They're trying to look for the error, but not only that, most of the errors are in details. They're in the details to the side, the color of the car, there's all sorts of things that are kind of side details that people do get wrong, but the central events that they're describing, that is rarely something that people get wrong. The one central event they're describing, the car really did hit the other car, or whatever it may be, the big things, they get those correct. Well, it's the same way if we think about the Gospels to do with the resurrection. Now, I happen to believe that every word of the Gospels is absolutely true, but we're talking about right now, just talking about the notion of the resurrection and the stories of the resurrection. And when it comes to the stories of the resurrection, they all agree that Jesus was raised physically from the dead on the third day. All of them agree on that. There's no disagreement on that. You have all the Gospels agreeing with that, as well as Mary Magdalene as the first witnesses, as well as the character and the type of the appearances afterwards. All of those, and I've got a chart in the book that actually just shows this so people can actually see this clearly. All of these line up. And so, yes, people that are eyewitnesses may misremember or perceive differently certain details, but the central truths, they get those right and they agree on those. And when they do agree on those, that is a way for us to understand that this is very likely true when you have multiple witnesses agreeing on these specific events, which is what happens in the Gospels.
You know, you look at all of these eyewitnesses, there's so many of them. There's very little incentive to be a witness to this resurrection. The synagogues had already begun casting people out if you had confessed Jesus as the Messiah. So talk about that. What was at stake in the life of an eyewitness at this point?
And you've hit just a very important issue right here, and that is, why would someone keep telling this story once it costs them everything? And I think that's something we have to raise. Why would you keep telling this story once it can cost you everything? Because by the time the eyewitnesses begin to die out, the 50s and 60s and 70s, when that's happening, there is persecution from the Jewish synagogues among the Jews who had not confessed Jesus as Messiah. There is persecution from the Romans beginning in 64 after the fire in Rome. You've got both sides are coming in persecuting, and yet these eyewitnesses persist all the way to the point of death, especially Peter and the two Jameses. There is so much good evidence for those outside the New Testament. So I'm not even talking about what's inside the New Testament. That's both inside and outside the New Testament. The evidence for Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus, and James, the disciple of Jesus, for their martyrdoms, for their faith, the evidence is excellent. And if anybody would have known whether or not Jesus was really raised physically from the dead, it would have been those three. They would have known this. And yet they went all the way to the death with nothing to gain. There is no property or wealth that they gain by doing this. There is nothing that they get from being the leader of an offshoot religious movement that's persecuted. There's nothing whatsoever that they can possibly gain from this, yet they persist in it. And they don't merely persist in it, they persist in it to the point of death. And people will die for a lie. That's happened all sorts of times in history, people dying for lies. But people will not typically die for what they know is a lie. And these individuals would not only have died for a lie if Jesus wasn't raised, they would have died for what they knew was a lie. That is very, very unlikely.
Dr. Jones, a recent Lifeway Research article was published recently, and it is entitled, "Americans Believe in Easter Resurrection but Aren't Sure Why It Matters." 66%, they say, of U.S. adults believe in the biblical account, but they don't see a connection between that and their life. As we end this discussion today, I'd like you to make a comment on those people who believe in the resurrection. They believe in the biblical account of that, but it's not part of their life. Would you speak to them and describe how essential the resurrection is to our lives?
The resurrection is God's triumph over death, suffering, and evil. And you, in your heart, every human being, we feel the weight and the ache of the evil in the world. And just know that if it all stopped at the cross, which is wonderful as what Jesus did through the cross was, if it stopped there, there is no promise from God of ever us having a release from the suffering, the sin, and the death in our world. There's no release from that. It is that he promises us. He triumphs over death. He triumphs over all of these things that came through sin entering into the world through Adam and Eve. And he does this in such a way as to be a public declaration, something that didn't happen in some sort of a mystical experience in a corner under a tree. It's something that happened publicly, physically, outwardly. And because of that, we can be certain and be guaranteed that God will make all things right and new. And the most beautiful part in that is where Mary encounters Jesus and she thinks he is the gardener. And indeed, he is. He is the one through whom the Garden of Eden was planted in the first place. He is the God who walked among the trees with Adam and Eve in the garden, and now here he is. And what he's declaring by that is what was lost in Eden, I am going to restore that, and my resurrection is my promise that I am going to make everything new, and all that was lost in Eden will be restored at the end and more. That's the beauty, the glory of the resurrection.
Amen. What a reason to celebrate. The booklet we've been talking about is Did the Resurrection Really Happen? You can get not only a single copy, but multiple copies at christianbook.com. And of course, you can order also from crossway.org. If you'd like to find out more about our guest, Dr. Timothy Paul Jones, you can go to his website, timothypauljones.com. And you can check out his podcast, which is simply called The Apologetics Podcast. Dr. Jones, thank you so much for being with us today, helping us celebrate the good news of the resurrection and to give us some answers that we can give to people around us when they're skeptical.
Thank you for having me.
Join us next time as we look at the signs of spiritual awakening across the country and discover the one ingredient that can revolutionize our prayer lives. Bill Eliff, pastor and church director for One Cry, will be our guest. If you've enjoyed today's program, you'll love The Stand magazine. Get a free trial subscription at afa.net/thestand. Thanks for listening, and join us next time on The Stand Radio.